With the proliferation of interest in qualitative research comes the real problem of how to evaluate it properly. Qualitative research has its own unique history, philosophical foundations, and methodologies that separate it from quantitative research. Criteria for evaluating qualitative research focuses on both the process and the product. That is, the research methods that we're using and the changing ideas themselves, the interpretation. Fortunately, the literature is increasingly providing insights into the ways we can evaluate research. However, as a researcher, you need to understand the standards of evaluation early in the research process. And today's session, we're going to give you an introduction to the basics of how to engage in rigorous research that meets criteria for engaging in excellence in qualitative studies.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in, because we're going to try and get through this lecture today on standards of evaluation and validation, and basically how do we go through and assess the quality of a study. I'm hopefully that this is going to be recorded quite clear for you guys, and any questions you have, you can ask me. I'll post these PowerPoints online around the same time this lecture is posted as well. So you guys should be able to get everything that you need. So what I want to start off by going through is thinking about what we mean by the standards of evaluation and validation. And if you guys remember this article from the very beginning of the class, the first week, we talked about the controversy surrounding using qualitative versus quantitative research. And the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, which is one of the largest and most widely established scientific journals, had actually made a statement that they were not willing to accept qualitative papers for a while because they felt that they were not rigorous enough, they didn't hold up to proper science, etc. And so you remember we talked about this, that there was a huge response from researchers in the qualitative community, and their big concern was that qualitative research wasn't being done properly. And so what we were seeing was a lot of poorly done qualitative research. And so this is why this whole push for doing better training around qualitative research, critiquing how people are doing qualitative research began. So it's sort of like we're coming back full circle in this discussion. But what they pointed out too is that the real issue is around the quality of the research and the guidelines by which we set up rigor and standards and the ways in which we evaluate research in terms of being able to understand the difference between good and poor quality research. And so the real issue that was being discussed was not whether or not qualitative research was poor or junk science, but how do we evaluate good qualitative research from poor qualitative research? And this is one of the big things that were critical. So even though we're doing this part of the lecture at the end of the course where we're talking now about how do you do quality research, I want you to remember I said that qualitative research is not a straight line. It's not a linear process like quant. It's very cyclical, meaning that you have to keep going back and checking and following steps through. So for looking at the way we can assess quality and qualitative research, it's something that you just don't do at the end, but you have to do from the time you start conceptualizing your research process. And I'm going to talk about how this happens. So the way this is happening in this class is that we're going to look at the debates around how we set up evaluation standards. That some people are saying there should be some level of a checklist, really established criteria, while others say it's more about a subjective, reflective process and showing how you do things. The role of the person who's evaluating and making the discussion and how they can identify the strengths and weaknesses. What is important to consider when you're thinking about rigor? What's included in our discussions about rigor and standards evaluation? And the two big crux of the debates and how we can establish that our research is rigorous, it is systematic, and it is scientific is through our evidence of trustworthiness and credibility. And we're going to show you how you can achieve that. So again, there's a big debate about evidence. Who determines what is science and what is not good research? And so that's really goes back to earlier discussions in the beginning of the semester. It feels like I'm going back to the start of there's this framework of who creates knowledge and who determines what is knowledgeable and who determines what is fact and fiction. And so you have to find out your philosophical assumption of where you fall on this continuum in terms of establishing understandings of what is good quality research. So right now there has been this growth in the push for creating established standards and norms. And this has really come out a lot because we're getting a wider range of people, and particularly people that think quantitatively, about how do we establish generalizability and reliability and being able to replicate studies. And these are more the people who come from a foundationalist perspective. And so you find that these are people that all research should have a shared criteria that we can checklist off about what's important. Then the quasi-foundationalists realize there is some level of criteria or some broad categories that are needed that should be checked, that can be checked off or should be looked at or considered or at least addressed and acknowledged in the process. So they're not as rigorous as saying that this has to be done, but it is important that they say that these are some criteria that should be evident in the research. And then the non-foundationalists are at the other end of the spectrum, where there's not a need to predict and outline what's happening. That's because the way that research is done is really sort of political and it's subjective. And so you find that having checklists or these established norms goes back to this idea of giving back power to other people to determine what is research and what's not, what's science. So there's these three sort of levels. I know I found into the quality foundationalist in that I don't like the idea of a checklist because it gets very quantitative in the thinking. And it's interesting as during discussions with people, they keep going back to, well, I need inter-rater reliability. We need to assess this. And how do we count that? That's a very different way of thinking about research. And again, this goes back to shifting away from this quantitative lens to a qualitative lens. So these concerns about having compliance with this sort of audit checking culture really questions the debate around where do values, purpose, and transformative and social justice lenses play into qualitative, which is the foundation. So there's a shift of trying to not make qualitative work just be pushed into quantitative lens, but also a need to not just have a free-for-all where anybody can sit there and say my work is, rigorous and qualitative. Now, one of the first places where these debates come up, or you have to sort of start thinking about that, is when you're looking at manuscripts reviewing. So I often get called on to be a qualitative methodologist in terms of, and methods, looking at this in terms of manuscripts. And so there's some broad things that are really helpful to look at, and the qualitative reporter sort of has some basic broad questions that you can look at to understand the quality of a paper. And the first is like, are there multiple forms of data gathered? So it's not just that I did open-ended questions or I did interviews. Did they also do things like their own notes, their audit trail? Did they also describe in detail, in thick descriptions, what's going on in the environment? Did they contextualize their work? So it's not necessarily just the data in terms of the transcriptions, but what other pieces of information are in there to show that they fully understand the political and the subjective nature of the research. Do they use appropriate tradition? So this goes back to methodology, which again, most people don't think about. Was grounded theory really the best way, or was it just an easy way of doing things? So can they justify why they picked a certain methodology? Is it the person has a single focus? So it's not just simply trying to predict this equals this, or that they're doing a comparative between groups, but they're really focused on a phenomenon and they express this in terms of the study. Again, there's a detailed description of the method. So it could be replicated. So basically when they say like a screenplay, or I like to use the idea of a recipe, that I can take your methods and replicate them and use the exact same thing again. And I might not find the exact detailed information, but I should be able to know what you did and not have to question what's happening. So it's not just simply that the methods describe, we then ask questions and we did this. There's also a detailed discussion of what took place before the data collection happened, during the analysis, afterwards, and even a reflexivity piece. And we'll talk about that later on. Is the writing persuasive? Is it really clear writing? Is the analysis layered, showing that there are multiple steps? Because remember, the analytical cycle goes over and over again. Was that highlighted, that it's not just this linear process? The writing is rich with detail and brings the story to life. So again, this goes back to thick descriptions, really showing that you've gotten into the research and you've gotten into the data and you've gotten into the community and you understand what's happening. And then the assumptions and characteristics are kept intact. So basically, there are multiple perspectives. There's a real engagement, and then you have engaged in steps of trustworthiness, credibility, etc. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So these are some overarching frameworks that we look at for research, and this is really helpful when you're really distinguishing what is really a quantitative lens being used to do what is thought of being as collected as qualitative research. And this is the most simplistic way of looking at that. And so when you ask these questions and you compare it between by somebody who's really thinking still quantitatively, you can tell the difference between rigorous qualitative research study versus a study that is attempting to be rigorous but really is just using a quantitative lens to do interviews or focus groups. And so these questions are really useful for thinking through that process. There's also some procedural checklists, and this is more the controversial approach of checking list with this is something that's been given to research, and were these things covered? And so this is more not just asking questions that you're looking for answers, but just, was this done? And this is, again, an example of a checklist that people have concerns about. And I want to stress, I also have put some checklists in weekly resources under this week, so you can see some other checklists that are used. And if you're early on, you might be more comfortable using a checklist. Again, I don't want to say it's terrible, but it might make you more comfortable in terms of feeling like I've done the key pieces, especially if you're not as comfortable doing qualitative research. So these are things: does the title reflect the study focus? Is the problem socially important? So not just is it not been studied, but have you justified the reason for the study? Is the literature review comprehensive? Has it conformed to ethics standards? And not just simply, yes, it was passed through the IRB, but you've also addressed all the other issues, like we talked about ethics dumping, we talked about the engagement, all of those things we talked about earlier on. Are the issues of sampling discussed? Not simply that I went here and it was a purposeful sampling and they filled out a survey, but you've talked about the politics and the inequalities and the biases that happen. Did the findings answer the question? So this is not hypotheses, but did what you found answer the questions you asked at the beginning of your study? And if not, you have to explain why and why not, what happened. Was the study written convincingly, and are issues of trustworthiness addressed? And again, you're going to hear this trustworthiness coming up, and I'll talk about it towards the end. Another step is transparent assessment. So it builds on the assessment of checklist, but it goes beyond just sort of this technical checking off of everything. So this is building on this. You can also make sure there are rich diversity of meanings that are identified and understood. Is there a sensitized appreciation of the worth of the data? Are you showing cultural humility? Are you showing that you're deep within the culture and understanding of what's happening? Is there a deeper assessment of the analysis, not just simply we calculate up and this is what we found, etc.? Are there multiple paths to explore where you went to? And this goes back again to how you collect your data and your methodology and the methods. Was that discussed in terms of what paths we use, what tools we use, and how you looked at it? And then transparencies in the strength, credibility in terms of being really detailed in terms of your biases, and also being detailed in terms of what are the strengths of your paper. So what you're really seeing here is that it's not just enough to say, well, we did these, we followed the IRB and we ran it through SPSS, etc. That there's all this rigor, and this evaluation has to happen at all stages of the qualitative process. So when you're identifying your theoretical orientation, your methodology, your methods, how you're interpreting it, and how you're evaluating and presenting the results, you have to be able to justify rigor at all stages of analysis versus just at the end when the data has been collected and how you did it, which is a really sort of different way of looking at the research. So there are some primary standards, and the big one is trustworthiness. And this is one of the ways that you evaluate the rigor, the academic rigor of qualitative research. And this is particularly important because, remember, qualitative research is very subjective. We talk about this all the time. So you have to think about the ways in which trustworthiness is built into your research across all stages. So Guba, who again is one of the leading and foundational qualitative researchers, has done a lot of work around trustworthiness in naturalistic inquiries. So this is where not necessarily naturalistic is, of course, in the real world settings. And it points that you have to sort of look at the ways in which there's a different way of looking at concepts of validity and significance and soundness that shifts from the ways we do it traditionally in quantitative research. So specifically, they highlight the issues of validity and reliability, because I know that's something that's hammered into our heads. And so they are important in qualitative research, but they need to be conceptualized differently. So this is not to say that concerns that are in quantitative research are not applicable to qualitative research, but we have to have a different wording and approach to assessing these, because this is a very different way of engaging in research. So trustworthiness criteria evaluations, there are basically 4 broad categories that the qualitative research looks at, and they tie in both philosophical ideas about how to evaluate trustworthiness, as well as procedural steps and criteria for doing this. So is the work credible, credibility? So is it authentic? Is it real? Or is this something that just feels like Dion made this up and this is her personal interpretation? Transferability. It's not quite generalizability, but will this type of work, can you apply the same type of research project in a different situation? Dependability. Is there a logic and a method, and is there a mapped out audit trail of what the researcher did in terms of being consistent and being clear and following scientific approaches and what the prior research says? And confirmability. Can the interpreted results be defended within both the context of what it's being collected, but also in the broader research? So again, it's not just enough. A lot of people do research and they come in and they say, yep, I found what I thought I was going to find, etc. This forces you to go further and question all stages of how you came to where you are. So again, the philosophical criteria, again, it came from doing naturalistic research. So again, that's a very specific methodological framework. And some view it as being interpretivist as well as constructivist. So this is about the own subjectivity around how we come to interpret meanings. So the individual does it, as well as how we construct meanings, which are 2 different frameworks. And health research, particularly scientific, is usually very interpretivist, where it moves to a different way of centering people who are involved, particularly stakeholders or participants, in terms of having them engaged and having a say in the research. So it's widely used in qualitative research. And so in terms of how we're doing it in psychology, this is why I'm using this philosophical positionality to move within the studies. So when we're thinking about this, we all know these quantitative terms about internal validity, external validity, reliability, and objectivity. And if we're in class, I'd ask you to describe each of them, but you all know them. So the equivalent qualitative term is credibility. So how confident can we be about the truth of the findings? External validity would be transferability. So can we apply these findings to other contexts or with other groups of people? Reliability would be the equivalent, or would be transformed. Why didn't we say equivalent? It would be transformed to dependability. Can this be repeated? So if we took this inquiry or this study and put it with another population that was similar or context that were similar, would we find the same things? And if we don't, what does our record show of why it didn't happen that way? And then finally, objectivity is transformed into confirmability, sorry. So how is it that we can be certain that the findings and the subjects and the context of the inquiry are really reflections of what's going on with our participants, rather than our own biases and perspective as a researcher? So it's not, again, Dion said this is what's happening, but what I found in my research really does frame the voices and the experiences of the participants that's taking place. So this credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability, I'm going to go more in depth with at this point. So let's start off first with the concept of credibility. And normally I'd have you guys first share what you think it is. So again, quantitative research values internal validity. So the study's design reflects what's observed. So again, the reimagined framework is credibility. And credibility is considered, you often see trustworthiness, credibility put together, because it's one of the most important factors in establishing trustworthiness. In fact, when you're presenting your research, and I'll talk about this later on, trustworthiness and credibility are the 2 most important terms that you want to show and specifically state in your research when you're publishing or doing a dissertation or presenting it, in terms of showing the fact that your research is rigorous. So it involves establishing that your results are both credible and believable. And it's key, this, from the perspective of the participant. So what you're saying does reflect what the participants say. So basically, this is where you're describing it from the participant's eyes. So if your research is not credible, then it can't be accurately transferable. So this is where you're adding the truth and the accuracy to your research, and they call this a truth value. And this is basically that what you found is the truth, and it is applicable and part of the rigorous steps in terms of qualitative research. Next, we have the concept of transferability. And again, this is where I would ask you guys, tell me what you think transferability is, but you're not there or here in live in person. So again, transferability, people think of it in terms, if you're quantitatively, it's like external validity. So like the idea of generalizability, but transferability is really the equivalent, or the transformed meaning of it would be tied to external validity. And so can we apply these findings to other contexts with other groups? So the degree to which the qualitative research can be put with other contexts and other respondents. And this is something that we have to think about. So when we're doing this, it's not simply that the research, you can't prove the study's findings are going to be applicable, because that's not your job, is to prove. It's not about this, but it's about providing evidence. And we're going to talk about providing evidence in a minute. And there goes the dog. Okay, so the neighbor just brought over some groceries in this time of stress, so that was why the dogs went crazy. But anyway, where I was saying is that the idea is that you have to provide evidence. And so this is, again, making sure that other people can make judgments, so that you're transferring the judgments to other people, that you're giving other people the power to also see that your research is rigorous. So what you're doing is that you're having the participants express to the researcher what's being said, and then you have to make sure that you're being clear in giving voice, or I don't even like the term giving voice, but really presenting what the researchers themselves, the participants themselves, are saying. And then people who are outside the study, so the researchers, other researchers, and other readers themselves, they themselves have enough evidence based on all the documentation you're going to provide that this what you've presented is accurate. So it's not enough for me to just present the work. I have to give enough background and research information for other people to say that, yes, what Dion's presented here does make sense, it is applicable, and it would be useful, and this would be an accurate assessment of her interpretation of her data. Next concept is dependability. And this, again, remember we have the 4 parts there of trustworthiness. So dependability is critical to think about, because we think about it, again, quantitatively, we might compare it most closely to reliability. So is the instrument, is what we're asking really getting to what we want to know? So the equivalent of this, again, would be dependability, which is, why is it not clicking on here? Would the findings be repeated if inquiry were replicated with the same or similar subjects in different contexts? So it's like being able to repeat the study over and over again. So there has to be evidence that you were not just randomly making decisions as you went through. So there has to be a stable and consistent research process. And if you didn't make mistakes, and if you have to have a record of why you made certain decisions, why did you use certain populations, why did you use certain methods, and all of this makes sense because it helps you then say, well, this is how you got to this conclusion. So why did you use focus groups instead of interviews? Well, just saying, well, because everybody else uses interviews that does this topic, that's not good evidence of dependability. So you have to show stable and consistent records of why you did things. So, and it should be grounded within the research and within your methodological choice, or it doesn't have the same level of rigor, and it shows that there's more inconsistencies in your process. And if you're inconsistent in your process, that becomes problematic. So think of it this way: is if you're doing stuff with adolescents and one day, and for a week you're giving them lunch every time they come, and then the next time they come, you don't even give them lunch, but you expect them to do the same level of work, that's going to change your results. It's almost the same type of concept we're working with here. So it has to show the logic that you used for doing the study, but also it's a record of how you did it, and you kept consistent throughout the study, and you thought about areas where there were inconsistencies and addressed them in your work. And then the last one that we want to talk about is confirmability. And of course, this is when I'm taking the last one, the last of the major four categories for trustworthiness. And confirmability is most closely tied to the objectivity in terms of biases of the researcher and biases in the research process. So when you're thinking about it, qualitative is about biases. We acknowledge that, the whole reflexivity statement. So the issue is not simply that, yeah, we're biased, that's fine. It's also about being systematic in discussing and acknowledging your biases in terms of why you made decisions and how it informed your research process. So what's happening is that your biases you don't want to study that's just totally about Dion's perspectives, Dion's political beliefs, Dion's worldview. I'm obviously going to bring those into there, but I should be able to outline them, improve them. And somebody on the outside, and they use the term devil's advocate, should be able to question these biases and how they affect the research. And I should be able to also acknowledge how my biases played a role in the research as well. So it's both the biases and and how even the biases, particularly looking at of the researcher, because again, this is critically important to think about, because the researcher is the tool of analysis across all stages of the study. So when you're thinking about all of these things, those are sort of shaping the philosophical assumptions, but then how do you procedurally address them? And this is what we talk about, the procedural criteria. So we talked about how there's a philosophical assumptions of how we think about it, but then what are the procedures for actually addressing these? And so the procedural criteria will focus predominantly on the quality of the methods, the quality of the data, and the quality of the data analysis. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. So again, we've already talked about these terms of when we're thinking about what is credibility, what is transferability, what is dependability, and confirmability, which is the slideshow we already talked about, and what you're asking. So these are, again, here, the philosophical underpinning questions. But okay, so we know what they mean, we know what we're questioning, but how can you actually, in a real concrete framework, then shift them to strategies to address them? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And this is the piece that's really important, because you can't go back at the end of the study and put these things in place. These are things that had to have been done early on. So for internal validity, for credibility, the strategy you can do is prolonged engagement in the field, use of peer debriefing, triangulation of your data and your tools, member checks and time sampling, transferability, you use thick description, you provide it throughout your presentation of the results and of your research project, using purposeful sampling. For dependability, creating that audit trail. We talked last week about the memoing and auditing. The read code strategy, which is what we did in the class when you guys were coding and recoding and going back. Triangulation again, and peer examination. And then confirmability, which is again triangulation and practice reflexivity. And I'm going to talk about each of these now, so don't panic that the slide's changing. So what are you talking about member check? Well, member check is, when we're talking about the members in this case, the members are the participants. So this is not uncommon, is that after you analyze and interpret the data, you send it back to the participants, or just a few of them, to evaluate your interpretation. So it's been suggested that if people are unhappy with it, then they might be unhappy, not so much because you don't change it because they don't like what they said, but if they've been misinterpreted. Or they're unhappy with it. So it's not just simply like, oh, I don't like that, I want to change what I said, because at that moment that was the data. But it's also making sure your interpretation is correct. And this is particularly important when you're not a member of the culture, or you don't have enough background in the culture, that you're basically checking, like, this is how I interpret it. Doesn't mean you have to give them every single detail of the results, but it could be like, these are the codes that I found. This is what the code meant to me. This is what I thought it meant. And so those are engaging in member checking. So you could say credibility was achieved through member checking. We specifically pulled out 5 participants and shared with them our preliminary results and got feedback from them. That's one evidence. Another one is prolonged engagement. And that would be simply not, it's not enough to say, well, I did interviews with Indian women on dating violence, which I did, and I went there and I pulled them together and they came and met me and I sent out flyers and I was engaged. No, prolonged engagement would be, I go to India for the last 10 years and I've spent a lot of time working with adolescents in after-school programs, participating in interventions that look at violence, and also working at health clinics and taking visits with cultural experts, etc. So it's about your extended time in the context. And it's not enough to just be like, well, I went there and I was leading one focus group. It's over a period to show that you have built trust with the community, you have a greater understanding of the culture and the context in a real meaningful way. And then peer debriefing is different. People confuse member checks. So peer debriefing are people who have the peers in terms of your research peers. And these are people who are professionals who provide scholarly guidance. So these are people who have experience with the methods, who have a long history of engaging in research on your topic. So these could be like academic staff, your dissertation committee, research area experts. Academic staff might be the librarian who helped you if you had to do some big lit review that shows that, yes, she did use all the databases. She did go through all the steps for a rigorous analysis and finding this out. So this is really sort of the academic peers that you're talking about, rather than the members who are the participants. Now, again, don't give a value that if you have member checks, you don't need peer debriefing, or if you have peer debriefing, you have member checks. These are just different steps. And again, I'm going through steps. You might not have all of them, but you need to have at least one or two on each of these four here. So this is, again, for credibility. These were the ones that we talked about earlier. The next one is transferability. So one of them is thick description. So this is where you not just describe your research, but you can also describe the community. You can describe the culture, you divide the history. So it's sort of framing that what your data collected is within a specific phenomenon. So for example, if you're doing a study on sex trafficking and you're interviewing people whose attitudes towards sex trafficking, and you've been doing it all the time, you just talk about what's happened, and you're doing it in Miami, you talk about the culture of Miami and what's happening. Now, if all of a sudden the Super Bowl comes along, you also then have to say and some of you did 5 interviews during Super Bowl time, then thick description would be, these 5 interviews were actually done during Super Bowl time, because Super Bowl is known as a time when there's higher levels of sex trafficking and the media has higher awareness, there's more police presence, so there's greater discussion of it. So that's going to shape what's happening as well. So you really sort of have to talk about the ways in which the culture, the time, the context, all of these things are really shaping what's happening in a research study. So you as students right now near the end, if I start asking about graduate student stress, it would be very different if I'm asking you at the very end of the semester versus if I asked you during the second week. So all of those things have to be described and discussed within it. So it's making explicit the patterns of cultural and social relationships that put it in the context to understand your data. Purposeful sampling, you've talked about this, is about who are your subjects? Why did you select them? What's the criteria? And how did this sample then inform what you found? So it's different than just like, oh, I had 15 Hispanic women who were all emerging adults who respond to survey. So it's not just simply describing the demographics, but it's also explaining how these demographics or these population were important and integral to your study project. Like, so why did I interview Hispanic females? Is it because it was just easy to do that in my study or HPV? No, I chose Hispanic females who were emerging adults because Hispanic females have high rates of HPV acquisition. Emerging adulthood is important because that's where they're pushing the booster phase. So there's a developmental reason as well. And Hispanic women tend to have, after the age of 18, they tend to have lower rates of sexual onset outside of marriage. So they would be the most ideal group for boostering. So I just didn't pick Hispanic females because they were there and they have high rates. I justified it in terms of developmentally why it's important, in terms of the topic I was looking, HPV vaccine boostering, etc. So it's got to be more detailed than just presenting the aggregate or the demographic basic data that we typically see. So let's talk now about dependability. So we talked about briefly stepwise replication. And this is more of what we also did in the class, which is different than inter-rater reliability. So this is where 2 or more researchers analyze the same data separately and compare the results. So you both looked at the codes, or your team looked at the codes, and then you came back and you saw what was happening. Now you're not checking for inter-rater reliability, but this is where you're testing what inconsistencies need to be addressed. Is there something going on? This could also be done with the focus group questions, that you also had the questions and you asked someone, did this make sense? Are we getting the same information? So this is not the same as inter-rater reliability in that it's more that what were the inconsistencies? They were not necessarily numerically identified, and I'm going to talk about interreliability, but it was through a discussion. And that's what's different. And there's not a push on, did we have 3, did we have 5, and why we picked them, etc. So it's more about an evaluation of what we found and how does this fit within our understandings of what we're trying to ask. Code recode strategy, we've done this. It's where the researcher codes the same data twice. And usually, ideally, you take a break of at least 2 weeks between there. It could also be going through when you're taking your notes that you're first thinking these are the codes, and then you come back later and you go back between them. And then you look at the results between the 2 codings to see if the results are the same or different. And you should be, again, keeping a record through your analytical memoing of what you've decided and what steps went through for doing these. Next, we have confirmability. And this is, again, going back through your audit trail. So a reflexivity journal. So this is your sort of diary of self-critiques throughout the process. And it's sort of, again, going back to making sure that your biases are put forth, that you're very clear about the ways in which you have your subjective beliefs and how this informed the research processes. So it's also not just simply in terms of your belief systems, but also your feelings and opinions. And if you go back to the week that we did subjectivity and philosophical assumptions, there's a paper that one of the examples I gave you was from an NIH study of working with health systems. And that one's really good for looking at this. Let me see if I can show you guys this. Yes, it is here. So if we go to Wix, qualitative here, the website is loading up. And if you go under assignments and subjectivity statement, a really great way of addressing this is looking at the one that's the open disclosure of adverse events to patients in the National Health Service. This is something you could say too. I did confirmability by developing this, the detailed statement for reflexivity. So this can be something you put at the end. So this is basically your record of everything you did to sort of reflect on what was happening. So your audit trail, etc. And here's the reflexivity, sensitivity to the ways the research and the research process might be shaped by the data. So they talk about their prior assumptions, their awareness of the social settings and the social distance between the researcher and the research, fair dealing and awareness of the wider social and political context, and the role of the research team as collaborators in the production of knowledge, potential for psychological harm. So they address this by putting an appendix of their reflexivity journal essentially here. And this is a great way of just saying, to address confirmability, we summarized our reflexivity journal, see Appendix 8, and this is kind of showing a nice trail. Related to this is your audit trail. And this one you might not put in a whole study, but the audit trail, oops, I went too far there. The audit trail is how you did the research. So this is not so much about your reflections and your biases, but what was the process and what were the step-by-steps. So how was the data collected and recorded? What was the method of data coding and analysis? It's not just simply writing out your methods section, but also showing what decisions took place and what activities you did to push those decisions or make those decisions part of your research process. So again, this is again your audit trail of what you're doing here. And then of course triangulation, which is using multiple forms of data and resources and theories to show that you didn't just come up with a study, but you have multiple ways of backing up and providing evidence about your decision making. So their data source, triangulation of methods, so mixed methodology is already a triangulation. Researcher, you have other people involved, and your theory, so you might have multiple theories. So it allows people to look from different lenses to see that, you know what, this research does draw on multiple levels of rigor and approaches, and you could see that in terms of how the research fits. So another approach that's used is inter-rater reliability, which is really a quantitative way of thinking about it. And there's nothing wrong with it, but it's always people like, I want to do inter-rater reliability. I want to do inter-rater reliability. Again, if you still are pushing for that, that's really a quantitative way of thinking. But it is recognized as a method of ensuring trustworthiness, particularly when you have multiple people involved in the coding. So IRR, inter-rater reliability, is when you have a large data set. And so what's suggested, and you can cite Walther here, and we have this posted, it's a way to mitigate interpretive biases. This is not necessarily researcher biases, but interpretive biases. So what it is that inter-rater reliability occurs only during the analysis phase. So it's not necessarily at other stages. So it's a continuous dialogue between researchers to maintain consistency of the coding. So again, you'll see it's specifically during the analysis phase. So what they suggest is that an 80% agreement of coders on 95% of the codes is a great way of framing it, sort of like significance. Again, you can see this is a very quantitative way of thinking. And if you have QDA, qualitative data analysis software, most of them will give you an IRR agreement. So those of you quantitatively, this is a great way of thinking about things. And a lot of journals that are just now shifting to qualitative are always like, well, where's inter-rater reliability? Again, I want us to not just view that this is what you have to do. And in fact, if you're reading a lot of your articles, unless most of them don't talk about inter-rater reliability if they're from a strong qualitative background. It does not mean that qualitative researchers don't believe in it, but it's important that we don't get pulled back into this quantitative way of checking on things. But it is fine to use. So the idea is that the reliability, again, reliability is a quantitative term, is a number of agreements over the number of agreements and disagreements together. So that's how you can kind of figure out your inter-rater reliability. Now, if we're in the class, we're going to have an activity where I was giving you a trustworthiness table, and you were going to discuss how the 4 components, which is credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability, how you addressed each of these in your study. And so this is something you should do anyway in your study, is that you can have a table like this where how did you do credibility? Here, how did you do confirmability? How did you do dependability? How did you do transferability? And so these are examples, and this was taken from a study that I say was looking at HPV in India. So they did peer review in the developing the design, and go back to thinking about what peer review was, external peer examination with the client's organization. So this was having external peers look at what was happening, independent external examination, joint analysis between the researchers. These are the codes. OMP is the researcher, and the initial, and the local villagers, researchers in the village. So this is where you did the analysis with other people. So you brought in not just you, the research team, but other people who have on the ground experience, immediate analysis in the field with fresh recollections and memories activities, negative case reviews. So what happens where it doesn't fit? So you also looked at the things that don't seem to fit, triangulation of sources and methods, member check and consultation, including nationwide. So they contacted people who have expertise beyond the research site. Structural coherence and consistency between the data and interpretation. So this is again where you made sure that everything matched in terms of your processes. And then using quotes in the writing up. So you're actually putting the quotes in there to make sure people can see this is what was said. Then this is focus groups, and this KII was the researcher's initials notes, debriefing notes, and district notes. So this again is your audit trail. The researcher did journaling on major decisions. So this was again, so the one up here, debriefing notes, are more about the personal opinion ones, and this is more of the process ones of what decisions were made, why did things happen in terms of the research process. Systematic coding and data reduction materials. So they were very clear in how they did the coding and how they analyzed the data. The dependability they did here was they did peer debriefing of the data analysis. They did triangulations of the researchers, did stepwise replication techniques. So the researchers all did the stepwise replication where they did the coding one day and they came back 2 weeks later and did it again. They got together to see how it works. Peer reviewing the reports. So they looked at what came out. They looked at it in terms of the themes that emerged and also in terms of the methodological framework that guide the study. They also had not just the audio recording, but visual materials. So for example, the diagrams we had, if they took pictures, all of these things were used within the research. Transferability, they had thick descriptions of the context and methods. They had actually a comparison of the sample against the wider population, and they used purposeful sampling. So this is an example of the strategy you use. You could put this at a table when you're presenting your research of how you did it, but more often you just say, to ensure trustworthiness, we were able to achieve the 4 areas of trustworthiness identified by Lincoln and Guba as critical, such as credibility. We did this by doing this. Confirmability was achieved by doing this. Dependability was achieved by doing this. And transferability was achieved by doing this. You are not most likely going to get every single one of these strategies that you can use, but you should be able to have at least 2 of these strategies that you use throughout the research process. This goes back again to why it's hard to do this research, to teach this class, because you kind of have to know these strategies and points for evaluation when you start, because you can't go back later and go, oh yeah, I did this, so I kind of did this. So when you're doing the research study, you have to be thinking about how you're going to establish rigor from the very beginning.